behind the grand walls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets sleep in silence. One small act of kindness would expose a truth that shook the very foundation of the modern monarchy. When Queen Camilla quietly took Princess Charlotte's beloved doll and locked it away in an antique trunk, she thought she was teaching a lesson about royal behavior. She never imagined that a loyal palace guard's conscience would lead him to unlock that trunk 3 days later, setting in motion events that would reveal the hidden tensions, jealousies, and power struggles that exist even in the most privileged family in the world. What started as a simple dispute over a child's toy became a window into the complex relationships between step-grandmother and granddaughter, between old royal traditions and new family dynamics, and between the public image of unity and the private reality of a family still learning to blend together. This is the true story of how one doll, one trunk, and one guard's decision to do what he believed was right exposed the delicate balance of power within the walls of the palace, and how sometimes the smallest acts of rebellion can have the biggest consequences. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the East Wing nursery at Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors where 8-year-old Princess Charlotte sat cross-legged, carefully braiding the golden hair of her most treasured possession. The doll, named Rosie, had been a gift from her late great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, given to Charlotte on her 4th birthday with a gentle smile and words that still echoed in the young princess's memory. "This doll has watched over royal children for generations, my dear. Now she'll watch over you." Rosie wasn't just any doll. She was a Victorian-era porcelain beauty with delicate features painted by hand, dressed in miniature replicas of actual royal gowns from the 1800s. Her tiny wardrobe included 7 different outfits, each one a masterpiece of historical accuracy, complete with microscopic buttons made of real pearl and lace trim that had been carefully preserved for over a century. The doll had belonged to Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, then passed down through generations of royal children, each one adding their own small touches to Rosie's collection. Charlotte had spent the last 4 years creating elaborate storylines for Rosie, turning the nursery into a miniature kingdom where the doll ruled as queen over an army of stuffed animals, toy horses, and wooden soldiers. She would spend hours arranging tea parties, conducting royal ceremonies, and even holding court sessions where Rosie would settle disputes between the other toys. For Charlotte, Rosie wasn't just a plaything, she was a confidant, a connection to her royal heritage, and a source of comfort during the difficult times when her parents were away on official duties. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, Charlotte was preparing for what she called Rosie's Spring Ball, an elaborate event that would involve all the toys in the nursery and require 3 costume changes for the guest of honor. She had spent the weekend planning every detail, from the menu of pretend delicacies to the order of dances that the toy couples would perform. Charlotte had even convinced her younger brother, Prince Louis, to participate as the official herald, though his attention span for such games was notoriously short. The sound of heels clicking against marble floors announced the approach of someone important, and Charlotte looked up to see Queen Camilla entering the nursery with her usual measured stride. Camilla had been trying to establish a role as step-grandmother to William's children, but the relationship remained delicate and somewhat formal, especially compared to the warm, natural bond the children had shared with their great-grandmother Elizabeth. Camilla surveyed the nursery with a critical eye, taking in the scattered toys, the elaborate doll setup, and Charlotte's focused concentration on her play. The queen consort had strong opinions about how royal children should spend their time, believing that too much frivolous play could interfere with the serious business of learning royal duties and proper behavior. She had grown up in a different era, where children were expected to be seen and not heard, and where playtime was strictly scheduled and supervised. "Charlotte, darling," Camilla said in her crisp accent, "don't you think you're getting a bit old for such childish games? You're 8 now, nearly 9. It's time to start focusing on more appropriate activities for a young lady of your position." Charlotte looked up from Rosie's hair, confusion clouding her young face. She had never been told her games were inappropriate before. Her father, Prince William, often joined in her elaborate storylines, and her mother, Catherine, had helped her create some of Rosie's more recent outfits. The idea that her beloved doll was somehow wrong or childish had never occurred to her. "But Granny gave her to me," Charlotte replied softly, using the name she had called Queen Elizabeth. She said Rosie was special, that she belonged to royal children for a long time. Camilla's expression tightened slightly at the mention of the late queen. Since Elizabeth's death, Camilla had been working to establish new traditions and rules within the palace, partly to help the family move forward, but also to assert her own authority as the new queen consort. References to how things used to be done under Elizabeth's reign were a constant reminder of the shoes she was trying to fill and the comparisons she couldn't escape. "Yes, well, times change, dear," Camilla said, her tone becoming firmer. "Your great-grandmother had different ideas about childhood, but I believe children benefit from more structure and purpose in their activities. Perhaps it's time to put away childish things and focus on learning skills that will serve you better as you grow older. Piano lessons, proper deportment, languages, these are the things that will make you a credit to the royal family." Charlotte clutched Rosie closer to her chest, feeling a sudden surge of protectiveness. The suggestion that she abandon her doll felt like being asked to abandon a dear friend, or worse, to reject a precious gift from someone she had loved deeply. Queen Elizabeth had never suggested that playing with dolls was inappropriate. In fact, she had often asked about Rosie's adventures and seemed genuinely interested in Charlotte's elaborate stories. "I don't want to put Rosie away," Charlotte said, her voice small but determined. "She's not hurting anyone, and Granny said she was special." The defiance in Charlotte's voice, mild as it was, clearly frustrated Camilla. She had been hoping to guide the children toward what she considered more appropriate behavior without conflict, but Charlotte's attachment to the doll was proving more stubborn than expected. In Camilla's mind, this was exactly the kind of situation that required firm leadership. She couldn't allow a child to dictate terms, even if that child was a princess. "Charlotte, you need to understand that being royal comes with responsibilities," Camilla continued, her tone taking on the authority she used when addressing staff members. "Other people look up to you, and they expect you to set an example. Playing with dolls like a common child doesn't project the right image for someone in your position." The phrase "like a common child" stung Charlotte more than Camilla probably intended. Charlotte had always been taught that being royal meant being kind, dutiful, and caring about others, not that it meant being better than other children or avoiding normal childhood activities. Her parents had worked hard to give her and her siblings as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their unique circumstances. "Mama says I'm still a child, and that it's important to enjoy being young," Charlotte replied, her voice wavering slightly as she sensed the growing tension in the room. Camilla's patience was wearing thin. She had not expected such resistance from an 8-year-old, and the fact that Charlotte was quoting her mother's more permissive parenting style felt like a direct challenge to her authority. This was exactly the kind of situation Camilla had worried about, the children being influenced by conflicting messages about appropriate royal behavior. "Your mother means well, but she doesn't always understand the full scope of royal expectations," Camilla said, immediately realizing that criticizing Catherine, even mildly, was probably a mistake. "What I mean is, as you get older, you need to start making more mature choices about how you spend your time." Charlotte stood up slowly, still holding Rosie tightly against her chest. At 8 years old, she didn't fully understand the complex family dynamics at play, but she could sense that this conversation was about more than just her doll. There was something in Camilla's tone and body language that made Charlotte feel like she was being asked to choose sides in a conflict she didn't understand. "I promise I'll do my piano practice and my French lessons," Charlotte said, trying to find a compromise. "But please don't make me put Rosie away. She's special to me." Camilla looked at the young girl's earnest face and felt a moment of uncertainty. Part of her recognized that she might be pushing too hard, too fast. But another part of her, the part that had spent years fighting for recognition and respect within the royal family, felt that this was a crucial moment. If she backed down now, If she allowed Charlotte to disregard her guidance, it would set a precedent that could undermine her authority in future situations. I think it would be best if Rosie went away for a while, Camilla decided, extending her hand toward the doll. Just until you're ready to focus on more appropriate activities. Think of it as growing up, taking the next step in your royal education. Charlotte stepped backward, shaking her head. No, please. I'll be good, I promise. I'll do whatever lessons you want, but please don't take Rosie away. The sight of Charlotte's distress should have given Camilla pause, but instead, it reinforced her belief that the child was too attached to something that was ultimately just a toy. In her mind, learning to let go of childish attachments was part of growing up, and doing it in a controlled, supportive environment was kinder than allowing Charlotte to become even more dependent on the doll. Charlotte, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be, Camilla said, her voice taking on a tone of finality. The doll will be perfectly safe. I'm not throwing it away or destroying it. I'm simply putting it somewhere safe until you're ready to move on to more mature interests. But, to Charlotte, the distinction between having Rosie temporarily taken away and having her permanently removed felt meaningless. The doll was her companion, her link to her beloved great-grandmother, and her source of creative inspiration. The idea of being separated from Rosie, even temporarily, felt like a punishment for some crime she didn't understand she had committed. When Charlotte continued to resist, clutching the doll even tighter, Camilla made a decision that would have consequences none of them could have predicted. She gently but firmly took Rosie from Charlotte's reluctant hands, despite the little girl's tears and protests. Charlotte's cries echoed through the nursery, bringing concerned staff members to the doorway, but Camilla waved them away with a gesture that indicated she had the situation under control. "This is for your own good, Charlotte," Camilla said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears as she looked at the child's tear-streaked face. "You'll understand when you're older." With Rosie tucked under her arm, Camilla left the nursery, leaving Charlotte sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the elaborate setup for the spring ball that would now never happen. The other toys seemed to stare accusingly from their positions around the room, as if they too understood that something precious had been taken away. What Camilla didn't realize as she walked through the palace corridors with the doll was that her actions had been witnessed by several staff members, including James Morrison, a palace guard who had worked at Windsor for over 15 years and had watched 3 generations of royal children grow up within these walls. James had seen the genuine distress on Charlotte's face, and something about the scene had troubled him deeply. As Camilla disappeared around the corner toward the private family quarters, James found himself thinking about his own 8-year-old daughter at home, and how he would feel if someone took away her most treasured possession in the name of teaching her to grow up. The more he thought about it, the more wrong the whole situation seemed to him. But James was just a guard, and Camilla was the queen consort. What could he possibly do about a family matter that was none of his business? Little did he know that his sense of justice and compassion would soon lead him to make a decision that would change everything, setting in motion events that would expose the hidden tensions within the royal family and ultimately bring unexpected allies together in the most unlikely of circumstances. James Morrison had worked at Windsor Castle for 15 years, long enough to witness the intimate moments of royal family life that the public never saw. He had watched Prince William take his first steps in the castle corridors, seen Princess Diana comfort her sons after scraped knees, and observed Queen Elizabeth's gentle interactions with her great-grandchildren. In all his years of service, James had maintained the strict boundary between observation and interference that was essential to his position. Palace guards were meant to be invisible protectors, present but not involved in family matters. But as James walked his evening patrol route that Tuesday night, he couldn't shake the image of Princess Charlotte's tear-streaked face from his mind. He had been stationed outside the nursery when Queen Camilla took the doll away, and he had heard every word of the conversation through the partially open door. What bothered him most wasn't just Charlotte's obvious distress, but the way the entire situation had been handled. In his years of service, he had never seen Queen Elizabeth or even a more demanding members of the royal family handle a child's emotions with such apparent disregard. James paused outside the blue drawing room, where he knew Queen Camilla often spent her evenings reviewing correspondence and planning her schedule. Through years of careful observation, he had learned the routines and habits of each family member, knowledge that was essential for providing effective security. He knew that Camilla typically spent an hour in this room before retiring, and he suspected that she might have stored Charlotte's doll somewhere nearby. The more James thought about the incident, the more it troubled him. He remembered his own daughter, Emma, and the fierce attachment she had to a stuffed rabbit that had been with her since birth. When Emma was 6, she had lost the rabbit during a family vacation, and the entire family had spent hours searching hotel rooms and calling airlines until they found it. The relief on Emma's face when the rabbit was returned had convinced James that these childhood attachments were more than mere whims. They were genuine emotional needs that deserved respect. As James continued his patrol, he found himself thinking about Queen Elizabeth's approach to the children. The late queen had always seemed to understand that childhood was precious and fleeting, and she had encouraged the young royals to enjoy their games and toys while they could. James had often seen her asking Charlotte about her doll's adventures, and she had even commissioned tiny replicas of the crown jewel for Rosie's collection, treating the child's imaginative play with genuine interest and respect. The contrast between Elizabeth's nurturing approach and Camilla's more rigid expectations couldn't have been starker. James understood that Camilla was trying to establish her own authority and traditions within the family, but targeting an 8-year-old's beloved toy seemed unnecessarily harsh and potentially damaging to the child's trust. Around midnight, as James made his rounds through the family quarters, he noticed a light still on in one of the smaller drawing rooms that Camilla sometimes used for private meetings. Curiosity and concern led him to approach quietly, and through the crack under the door, he could see Camilla sitting at an antique writing desk, apparently working on correspondence. But what caught his attention was what sat on the small table beside her. Charlotte's doll, Rosie, positioned upright as if she were keeping Camilla company. The sight of the doll sitting so casually beside Camilla, while Charlotte was presumably crying herself to sleep several floors above, struck James as deeply wrong. It wasn't that Camilla was being deliberately cruel, but there was something callous about the scene that made his protective instincts flare. In his mind, a child-beloved toy shouldn't be treated as a confiscated object to be displayed as a symbol of authority. James retreated from the door and continued his patrol, but he couldn't concentrate on his usual security checks. His mind kept returning to Charlotte's distress and to his own role as both a palace employee and a father. He had always prided himself on maintaining professional boundaries, but this situation felt different. This wasn't about royal protocol or official duties. This was about basic human decency and the treatment of a child. The next morning brought no relief from James's internal conflict. As he reported for his day's shift, he learned from other staff members that Charlotte had barely touched her breakfast and had spent most of the morning sitting quietly in her room, refusing to engage in her usual activities. Her nanny, Mrs. Patterson, had worked for the family for 8 years and had never seen the normally vibrant princess so withdrawn and listless. "She keeps asking for her doll," Mrs. Patterson confided to James during a brief conversation in the staff corridor. "I've tried to distract her with other activities, but she's just not herself. I don't understand why Queen Camilla felt the need to take away something that brought the child so much joy." James nodded sympathetically, but he could see that Mrs. Patterson was struggling with the same professional boundaries that constrained him. As staff members, they were expected to support the decisions of the royal family, even when those decisions seemed questionable. Speaking out against a senior royal's parenting choices could result in immediate dismissal and the end of careers that had taken years to build. But as the day progressed, and James observed Charlotte's continued unhappiness during the brief glimpses he caught of her during his patrols, his resolve began to shift. When he saw her sitting alone in the castle's private garden, staring listlessly at the flowers while other children her age would have been running and playing, something inside him snapped. That afternoon, James made a decision that went against every protocol he had learned in his 15 years of service. During his lunch break, he sought out Thomas Wells, the senior butler who had worked at Windsor longer than anyone except the most senior staff. Thomas was known for his discretion and wisdom, and James hoped he might provide guidance on this unprecedented situation. They met in Thomas's small office in the servants' quarters, away from the main flow of palace activity. Thomas listened carefully as James explained his concerns about Charlotte's situation, nodding occasionally, but maintaining the carefully neutral expression that had served him well through decades of royal service. "I've been thinking about this all night," James concluded. "I know it's not my place to interfere in family matters, but I keep thinking about how Queen Elizabeth would have handled this. She never would have taken away something that meant so much to a child, especially not as punishment for simply being a child." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but thoughtful. "You're right that this situation is unusual," he said. "In all my years here, I've rarely seen such a direct conflict between a senior royal's wishes and a child's obvious distress. Queen Elizabeth always believed that childhood should be protected and cherished, not rushed or criticized. So what do I do?" James asked. "I can't stop thinking about my own daughter and how she would feel in Charlotte's position. But I also can't afford to lose my job over something that isn't technically my responsibility." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering the delicate balance between loyalty to the crown and personal conscience that every palace employee navigated daily. "There might be a way to address this without directly challenging Queen Camilla's authority," he said slowly. "If the doll were somehow returned to Charlotte's possession without it being traced back to any specific staff member, it could be presented as the child finding a way to retrieve it herself. Children are naturally resourceful, after all." James understood immediately what Thomas was suggesting, but he also recognized the enormous risk involved. "You're talking about taking the doll from wherever Queen Camilla has stored it and returning it to Charlotte without permission." "I'm not talking about anything," Thomas replied carefully. "I'm simply observing that children sometimes find ways to retrieve things they care about, and that palace security occasionally experiences minor lapses that allow such retrievals to occur." The conversation ended there, but James left Thomas's office with a clear understanding of what was being suggested and tacit approval from the most senior staff member to proceed if he chose to do so. The decision was still his to make, but he no longer felt completely alone in his concerns about Charlotte's situation. That evening, as James began his night patrol, he had made up his mind. He waited until the family quarters were quiet and the senior royals had retired to their private rooms. Then, using his extensive knowledge of the castle's layout and his authorized access to most areas, he began searching for Charlotte's doll. He found Rosie in Queen Camilla's private study, locked inside an ornate antique trunk that sat in the corner of the room. The trunk was beautiful, made of dark wood with brass fittings, but to James it looked more like a prison than a storage solution. The fact that Camilla had felt the need to lock the doll away rather than simply putting it in a closet seemed to emphasize the symbolic nature of her action. James had access to a master key set for security purposes, and opening the trunk was technically within his authority as a guard conducting a security check. What he planned to do after opening it, however, was far outside the scope of his official duties. As he turned the key and lifted the heavy lid, he felt like he was crossing a line that he could never uncross. Rosie lay inside the trunk surrounded by old photo albums and personal papers, looking somehow forlorn and displaced. James carefully lifted the doll, struck by how light she was and how much distress something so small had caused. As he held her, he could almost understand Charlotte's attachment. The doll's face had a gentle, kind expression that would appeal to any child, and the craftsmanship of her clothing and accessories spoke to the care and history that had gone into her creation. The walk from Camilla's study to Charlotte's room felt endless. James encountered 2 other guards during his journey, but his authorized presence in the family quarters meant they simply nodded and continued their own patrols. Still, James felt like his intentions must be written across his face, and he was certain that anyone who looked closely would realize he was engaged in something far outside his normal duties. When he reached Charlotte's room, James paused outside the door, listening for any sound that would indicate she was still awake. The room was silent, and he assumed she was finally asleep after what had undoubtedly been a difficult day. Using his master key, he quietly entered the room and approached Charlotte's bed, where she lay curled up in an unusually small ball for such a normally confident and energetic child. James placed Rosie gently on the pillow beside Charlotte's head, positioning the doll so it would be the first thing the princess saw when she woke up. As he arranged the doll, Charlotte stirred slightly, and for a moment James feared she would wake up and discover him in her room, creating an impossible situation to explain. But Charlotte simply shifted position and continued sleeping, one hand unconsciously reaching toward the pillow where her beloved companion now waited. As James quietly left Charlotte's room and returned to his normal patrol route, he felt a mixture of relief, anxiety, and satisfaction. He had done what his conscience demanded, but he also knew that he had violated protocol in a way that could have serious consequences if discovered. Queen Camilla would certainly notice that the doll was missing from her study, and she would likely launch an investigation to determine how it had been retrieved. But as James walked through the familiar corridors of Windsor Castle, thinking about Charlotte's joy when she discovered Rosie's return and remembering Queen Elizabeth's gentle approach to childhood happiness, he found that he had no regrets about his decision. Some things were more important than protocol, and sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks that others might not understand. What James didn't know was that his action would set off a chain of events that would expose deep tensions within the royal family, challenge established power structures, and ultimately lead to changes in how the castle's youngest residents were treated. His simple act of compassion would prove that even in the most formal and traditional institutions, individual conscience and kindness could still make a difference. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the heavy curtains of Charlotte's bedroom when she stirred from a restless sleep filled with dreams of searching for something precious that remained just out of reach. As consciousness slowly returned, she became aware of something soft against her cheek, something that shouldn't have been there. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. There, lying on the pillow beside her with her familiar gentle smile and perfectly arranged golden hair, was Rosie. Charlotte sat up so quickly that she nearly knocked the doll to the floor, her heart racing with a mixture of joy, confusion, and disbelief. She grabbed Rosie and held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of the doll's antique clothing and feeling the solid comfort of her porcelain head and soft body. It was really her, really Rosie, somehow returned from wherever Queen Camilla had taken her. "How did you get back?" Charlotte whispered to the doll, as if expecting an answer. "Did you escape? Did you find your way back to me?" Charlotte's mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more magical than the last. Maybe Rosie had come alive in the middle of the night, like in the stories her mother read to her. Maybe Queen Elizabeth's spirit had helped her beloved great-granddaughter retrieve her precious gift. Or maybe, Charlotte thought with the practical wisdom that sometimes emerges in children, someone kind had decided to help. The sound of Mrs. Patterson's gentle knock on the door interrupted Charlotte's speculation. "Princess Charlotte, it's time to get ready for breakfast," the nanny called through the door. "Come in," Charlotte called back, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. Mrs. Patterson entered the room expecting to find the same listless, unhappy child she had left the night before. Instead, she discovered Charlotte sitting up in bed, fully alert and beaming, with her beloved doll clutched firmly in her arms. "My goodness," Mrs. Patterson said, stopping in surprise. "How did you manage to get Rosie back?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted, her smile never wavering. "She was just here when I woke up. Maybe she missed me too much to stay away." Mrs. Patterson approached the bed slowly, her mind working through the implications of the doll's mysterious return. As someone who had worked in royal households for over 20 years, She understood that very few things happened by accident within palace walls. Someone had made a deliberate decision to return the doll to Charlotte, someone with access to wherever Queen Camilla had stored it, and the ability to move through the castle undetected. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "I suppose we should get you ready for breakfast, and perhaps we should keep Rosie safe in your room today." Charlotte nodded eagerly, understanding the implicit suggestion that it might be wise not to advertise the doll's return until they understood how Queen Camilla would react to discovering her absence. As she got dressed for the day, Charlotte chattered happily to Rosie about all the games they would play and the adventures they would have, her natural energy and enthusiasm returning in full force. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Queen Camilla was beginning her own morning routine, unaware of the dramatic change in Charlotte's circumstances. Camilla typically started each day by reviewing her schedule and correspondence in her private study, the same room where she had locked Charlotte's doll away the previous afternoon. She had slept well, confident that she had handled a difficult situation with appropriate firmness, and that Charlotte would soon adjust to more mature pursuits. It wasn't until Camilla opened the antique trunk to check on some personal papers that she discovered the doll's absence. At first, she assumed she had misremembered where she had placed it, but a thorough search of her study revealed no sign of Rosie anywhere. The trunk had definitely been locked, Camilla was certain of that, and only senior staff members had access to the master keys that could have opened it. Camilla's initial confusion quickly gave way to anger. Someone had deliberately taken the doll from her private study. Someone who had not only disobeyed her direct instructions regarding Charlotte's toy, but had also violated the security and privacy of her personal space. In Camilla's mind, this wasn't just about a child's toy anymore. This was about respect, authority, and the proper chain of command within the palace. She immediately summoned Thomas Wells, the senior butler, to her study. Thomas arrived promptly, his expression perfectly neutral despite his knowledge of the previous night's activities. "Thomas," Camilla said without preamble, "someone has taken something from my private study. The doll I removed from Princess Charlotte's room yesterday is missing from the locked trunk where I stored it." Thomas maintained his carefully neutral expression. "I see, Your Majesty. That is certainly concerning. Have you considered the possibility that Princess Charlotte might have found a way to retrieve it herself? Children can be quite resourceful when they're determined to recover something important to them." Camilla's eyes narrowed. She knew Thomas well enough to recognize when he was being diplomatically evasive. An 8-year-old child did not somehow acquire a master key, locate my private study, and open a locked trunk, Thomas. This was done by a staff member, someone who chose to undermine my authority and interfere in a family matter. "Of course, Your Majesty," Thomas replied smoothly. "Shall I conduct a full investigation into the security breach? We could review the patrol logs, interview the night staff, and examine the lock for signs of tampering." The suggestion of a formal investigation gave Camilla pause. Part of her wanted to pursue the matter with full intensity, to identify the culprit, and ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their insubordination. But another part of her recognized that creating a palace scandal over a child's toy might not reflect well on her judgment or priorities. Before Camilla could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested he already knew about the morning's developments. "Camilla," William said, his tone polite but noticeably cool, "I understand there's been some confusion about Charlotte's doll." Camilla straightened, recognizing the carefully controlled anger in William's voice despite his diplomatic phrasing. As Charlotte's father and second in line to the throne, William's opinion carried significant weight, and his involvement complicated the situation considerably. "There's no confusion," Camilla replied firmly. "I made a decision about what was appropriate for Charlotte, and someone chose to undermine that decision by returning the toy without my permission." William stepped into the study, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. Thomas, recognizing that this was about to become a family discussion rather than a staff matter, quietly excused himself and left the room. With respect, Camilla, William said once they were alone. "You made a decision about my daughter without consulting me or Catherine. And apparently, someone else in this household disagreed with that decision strongly enough to take action." The implication that William supported whoever had returned the doll was clear, even though he was careful not to say so directly. Camilla felt a familiar surge of frustration at what she perceived as a lack of support from the family she was trying to guide and protect. "I'm trying to help Charlotte understand her responsibilities as a member of this family," Camilla said, her voice rising slightly. "Allowing her to remain overly attached to toys and childish games doesn't prepare her for the reality of royal life." "She's 8 years old," William replied, his own voice becoming more heated. "She's not the heir to the throne. She's a little girl who loved a doll that connected her to her great-grandmother. What exactly was the harm in allowing her to keep that connection?" The mention of Queen Elizabeth struck a nerve with Camilla, as William had probably intended. The comparison between her approach and Elizabeth's more nurturing style was a constant source of tension, and Camilla felt perpetually judged against a standard that seemed impossible to meet. "Your grandmother had different ideas about raising children," Camilla said defensively. "But times have changed, and the expectations placed on this family have changed as well. Charlotte needs to learn discipline and focus, not be coddled and allowed to live in fantasy worlds." "Whose fantasy world?" William asked pointedly. "Charlotte's world of imaginative play, or yours where an 8-year-old's happiness is somehow a threat to the monarchy?" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by Charlotte's voice calling for her father. She appeared in the doorway moments later, still in her nightgown with Rosie clutched tightly in her arms and Mrs. Patterson following close behind with an apologetic expression. "Papa!" Charlotte exclaimed, running to William without noticing the tense atmosphere in the room. "Rosie came back. She was on my pillow when I woke up, just like magic." William scooped his daughter up in a hug, his anger at Camilla temporarily displaced by relief at seeing Charlotte's happiness restored. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, though his eyes remained fixed on Camilla over Charlotte's head. Charlotte finally noticed Queen Camilla standing by the trunk, and her enthusiasm dimmed slightly as she remembered the previous day's confrontation. "I'm sorry if I was bad yesterday," she said quietly to Camilla. "I didn't mean to be disobedient." The sight of Charlotte's genuine contrition and her obvious effort to be respectful despite her hurt feelings should have softened Camilla's position. But instead it reinforced her belief that the child was too sensitive and needed firmer guidance. "Charlotte," Camilla said carefully, "someone took your doll from where I had stored it. Do you know how it got back to your room?" Charlotte shook her head, her eyes wide with innocent confusion. "No, ma'am. It was just there when I woke up. Maybe someone nice thought I was too sad without her." The simple honesty of Charlotte's response highlighted the fundamental difference in how she and Camilla viewed the situation. To Charlotte, someone had performed an act of kindness to comfort a sad child. To Camilla, someone had committed an act of insubordination that challenged her authority. William set Charlotte down gently and looked directly at Camilla. "I think it's clear that someone in this household cared enough about Charlotte's happiness to take a risk to restore it. Maybe we should focus on that rather than on punishment. And what message does that send about respect for authority and following rules?" Camilla asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier intensity. "It sends a message that kindness and compassion matter," William replied. "It sends a message that adults should protect children's happiness, not destroy it in the name of arbitrary rules about maturity." Charlotte looked back and forth between the adults, sensing tension she didn't fully understand, but recognizing that her doll was somehow at the center of a much larger conflict. She hugged Rosie closer, suddenly, afraid that the argument might result in losing her beloved companion again. As the morning progressed, and news of the doll's mysterious return spread through the palace staff, different reactions emerged that reflected the complex loyalties and relationships within the royal household. Some staff members were quietly pleased that Charlotte's happiness had been restored, while others worried about the implications of directly defying Queen Camilla's instructions. James Morrison, meanwhile, continued his duties as if nothing unusual had happened, though he found himself watching Charlotte's interactions with increased attention. When he saw her playing happily in the garden later that morning, talking animatedly to Rosie about their plans for the day, he felt a deep satisfaction that made the risks he had taken feel worthwhile. But James also understood that his actions had set something in motion that was bigger than just returning a toy to a child. The confrontation between William and Camilla, the questions about authority and compassion within the royal family, and the demonstration that palace staff were willing to act according to their own moral compass rather than simply following orders. These were developments that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. What remained to be seen was how those consequences would unfold, and whether the simple act of returning a child's beloved doll would ultimately strengthen or strain the delicate relationships that held the royal household together. 3 days after the doll's mysterious return, the atmosphere within Windsor Castle remained tense and uncertain. Queen Camilla had chosen not to pursue a formal investigation into the security breach, partly on Thomas Wells's advice, and partly because Prince William had made it clear that he would not support such action. But the underlying issues that had sparked the conflict remained unresolved, creating an uncomfortable dynamic that affected everyone from the royal family to the most junior staff members. James Morrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position. While no one had directly accused him of returning the doll, he could sense that some of his colleagues suspected his involvement. More concerning was Queen Camilla's increasingly sharp attention to security matters and staff behavior, clearly still frustrated by her inability to identify and punish whoever had defied her authority. The situation came to a head on Friday afternoon when James was summoned to meet with Sir Edward Hamilton, the castle's head of security. Sir Edward was a former military officer who had overseen palace security for over a decade, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his insistence on proper protocol and chain of command. "James," Sir Edward said as they met in his office, "I need to discuss the events of earlier this week with you. Specifically, the unauthorized removal of an item from Queen Camilla's private study." James felt his heart rate increase, but he maintained the calm exterior that his years of security training had taught him. "Yes, sir. I understand there was some kind of security issue." "Indeed there was," Sir Edward replied, studying James's face carefully. "Someone with access to master keys entered a private royal space and removed property that had been placed there by a senior member of the royal family. This represents a serious breach of protocol, regardless of the motivation behind it." James nodded, unsure whether Sir Edward was building toward an accusation or simply explaining the seriousness of the situation. "I understand the concern, sir. Have you identified the person responsible?" Sir Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Let me ask you something, James. In your 15 years of service here, how would you characterize your relationship with the royal children?" The question seemed to come from an unexpected direction, and James answered honestly. "I've always tried to maintain appropriate professional boundaries while ensuring their safety and security. I suppose I've watched them grow up, in a way, and I care about their well-being." "And how did you feel about Princess Charlotte's distress over losing her doll?" James realized that Sir Edward was leading him toward something, though he wasn't sure if it was a trap or an opportunity for honesty. "I thought it was unfortunate that she was so upset. Children form strong attachments to special objects, and it seemed harsh to remove something that meant so much to her." Sir Edward nodded slowly. "I've been having interesting conversations with various staff members this week," he said. "It seems that quite a few people shared your perspective on the situation. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that Charlotte was more upset than she'd ever seen her. Thomas Wells expressed concerns about the precedent being set for how children's emotional needs are addressed. Even some of the other guards commented on how listless and sad the princess appeared." James waited, unsure where this was leading, but increasingly convinced that Sir Edward already knew or strongly suspected his involvement in the doll's return. "The thing is," Sir Edward continued, "while protocol clearly dictates that staff should not interfere in family decisions, there's also a broader principle at stake here. We're not just employees of an institution, James. We're guardians of a family, protectors not just of their physical safety, but of their well-being in a broader sense. Yes, sir, James replied, still uncertain about Sir Edward's ultimate point. Queen Elizabeth understood this, Sir Edward said, and James detected a note of sadness in his voice. She knew that the staff who worked closely with the family developed genuine, caring relationships with them, especially with the children. She valued that emotional investment because she understood that people who truly care about the family's well-being make better protectors than those who are simply following orders. Sir Edward stood and walked to the window overlooking the castle grounds, where Charlotte could be seen playing with her doll in the garden below, her laughter carrying faintly through the glass. "I've made a decision," Sir Edward said without turning around. "I'm not going to pursue this investigation any further. Whoever returned that doll to Princess Charlotte acted out of genuine concern for a child's happiness. And, while it may have violated protocol, it upheld something more important." James felt a wave of relief so strong that he had to consciously control his expression. "Thank you, sir. However," Sir Edward continued, turning back to face James, "this situation has highlighted some broader issues that need to be addressed. Queen Camilla is still learning how to navigate her role within this family, and she may need guidance about balancing authority with compassion, especially when it comes to the children." Over the following days, a series of private conversations took place within the royal household that would ultimately reshape how family decisions were made and implemented. Prince William had several discussions with his father, King Charles, about the importance of ensuring that the children's emotional needs were considered in all family policies. Catherine, who had been traveling during the initial incident, returned home to find her daughter restored to her usual happy self, but also clearly changed by the experience. "Someone was very kind to you while I was away," Catherine observed as she tucked Charlotte into bed on Sunday evening, with Rosie safely nestled beside her. "Yes," Charlotte said quietly. "I don't know who it was, but they must have known how much I missed her." "Do you think it was someone who has children too?" Catherine smiled at her daughter's intuitive understanding. "I think it was someone who understands how important love is, whether it's love for a person or love for something special like Rosie." "Mama," Charlotte said, her voice becoming more serious, "was I wrong to love Rosie so much? Queen Camilla said I was too old for dolls." Catherine chose her words carefully, understanding that this conversation would likely shape Charlotte's relationship with both Camilla and her own sense of what was acceptable behavior. "Different people have different ideas about what's appropriate at different ages," Catherine said. "But I think the most important thing is to be kind and gentle with things and people we love. There's nothing wrong with cherishing something that brings you joy and comfort, especially when it reminds you of someone special like Great-Granny." The conversation that ultimately proved most significant, however, took place between King Charles and Queen Camilla in their private sitting room on Monday evening. Charles had spent the weekend reflecting on the events of the past week and their implications for family harmony and staff morale. "My dear," Charles said gently, "I think we need to discuss what happened with Charlotte's doll." Camilla had been dreading this conversation, knowing that her handling of the situation had created ripples throughout the family and household that were still being felt. "I was trying to help her mature," Camilla said defensively. "Royal children need to understand that they can't always have everything they want." "That's true," Charles agreed, "but they also need to understand that they're loved and that their happiness matters to the adults who care for them." Taking away something that clearly brought Charlotte such joy without explanation or compromise sent a different message entirely. Charles went on to explain the broader implications of the incident, including the staff members' willingness to act against direct orders when they perceived a child was being treated unfairly. He helped Camilla understand that her authority within the household would be stronger if it was based on respect and trust rather than fear and rigid compliance. "Perhaps," Charles suggested, "this could be an opportunity to rebuild your relationship with Charlotte in a way that shows both firmness and compassion." The next morning, Camilla approached Charlotte's nursery with a carefully prepared plan. She found the princess playing quietly with Rosie, and Charlotte looked up with obvious wariness when Camilla entered the room. "Charlotte," Camilla said, sitting down at the small table where Charlotte had been arranging a tea party, "I owe you an apology." Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise. In her 8 years of life, she had rarely heard adults, especially important adults, apologize to children. "I was wrong to take Rosie away from you," Camilla continued. "I thought I was helping you learn important lessons, but I didn't consider how much she meant to you or how taking her away would make you feel." Charlotte set down the tiny teacup she had been holding and looked directly at Camilla. "She's special because Great-Granny gave her to me," she said quietly. "When I play with her, I remember Great-Granny's hugs and the stories she used to tell me." Camilla felt a pang of understanding and regret. She had been so focused on what she perceived as inappropriate behavior that she had completely missed the emotional significance of the doll and Charlotte's need to maintain connections to her beloved great-grandmother. "I understand that now," Camilla said sincerely, "and I want you to know that whoever helped Rosie find her way back to you was very wise and kind. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and we need other people to help us see when we're wrong." Charlotte considered this for a moment, then picked up a second teacup from her set. "Would you like to have tea with us?" she asked shyly. "Rosie likes meeting new people, and I could introduce you properly." For the next 30 minutes, Camilla participated in an elaborate tea party with Charlotte and her doll, listening to stories about Rosie's adventures and learning about the rich, imaginative world that Charlotte had created. By the end of the visit, Camilla had gained a new appreciation for Charlotte's creativity and intelligence, and Charlotte had begun to see Camilla as someone who could be kind and understanding rather than just stern and demanding. James Morrison, observing this interaction from his post outside the nursery, felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond his relief at avoiding consequences for his actions. He had witnessed the beginning of a genuine relationship between step-grandmother and granddaughter, one based on mutual respect and understanding rather than arbitrary authority. In the days that followed, several positive changes became evident throughout the household. Queen Camilla began consulting with Prince William and Princess Catherine before making decisions that affected the children, creating a more collaborative approach to family governance. The staff members noticed a more relaxed atmosphere and felt more comfortable expressing concerns about family well-being when appropriate. Most importantly, Charlotte's trust in the adults around her was restored and even strengthened. She had learned that there were people in her world who would stand up for her happiness, even when it required taking risks, and that conflicts between adults could be resolved through honest conversation and compromise. 6 months later, James Morrison was quietly commended by Sir Edward Hamilton for his years of dedicated service and his deep commitment to the royal family's well-being. No specific incident was mentioned, but James understood that his actions had been noted, approved, and would be remembered as an example of the kind of moral courage that the royal household valued in its staff. Charlotte continued to play with Rosie throughout her childhood, eventually passing the doll on to her own daughter years later with stories about the kind people who had protected their friendship when it mattered most. The trunk where Camilla had briefly imprisoned the doll was repurposed as a storage place for Charlotte's growing collection of books, a change that seemed to symbolize the transformation from punishment to nurturing that had taken place within the royal household. And in the quiet moments when palace life allowed for reflection, James Morrison would sometimes think about the night he had chosen compassion over protocol, and how that choice had rippled outward to create positive changes that no one could have predicted. He had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could have the most lasting impact, and that standing up for what was right was always worth the risk, even when the stakes seemed impossibly high.